There's been this article floating around on the internet published on The Conversation, our beloved ABC and SBS. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the SBS version titled, "What are the philosophical concerns about the voice referendum? An ethicist explains." It was published on 25th of September 2023 by Paul Formosa. Paul Formosa is a professor at the Department of Philosophy at Macquarie University in Sydney. Of course, it comes as no surprise that he's probably a voice supporter, as we'll see throughout his article. It's supposed to be a piece on ethics, but it reads more like a Yes 23 campaign. Anyway, let's get started. As you probably are aware, Australians will be voting on an alteration to the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Professor Formosa posits two ethical concerns. First, is it appropriate for members of one group to decide what rights members of another group get? Why should non-Indigenous Australians get to decide if the First Peoples of Australia are granted an institutional voice? Okay, without diving too deep, I would suggest that of course non-Indigenous Australians should have a say in this. If they didn't, then it would only be Indigenous Australians voting on this. Essentially, the minority would be able to change the constitution of the majority, and that would be an absolute disaster if we allowed it. Whatever we have left of our democracy would be dead. Second, is it appropriate to give members of one group rights that members of another group lack? Isn't our system of government based on the idea that we are all equal and therefore we should all have the same rights? I would answer yes to that last sentence. Of course we should all have the same rights. It's the first yes I've answered this whole campaign. Regarding the first concern, should one group get to decide for another group? With regards to the same-sex marriage plebiscite and the harm that debate caused to the LGBT community, it's reasonable to ask whether that plebiscite should have occurred, given Parliament could have legislated same-sex marriage without the plebiscite. But despite the fact there are already reports of mental harm to First Nations people, considerations of whether or not we need this public vote do not apply to the voice. I would politely disagree with that. The voice, as a form of constitutional recognition that many, but not all, Indigenous people are seeking, can only occur via a referendum. I would argue that the voice can be done through legislation. Perhaps that's not what they want, but it could be done. The reason they don't want this is because future governments could easily get rid of it by passing another law. He goes on saying there's nothing unusual about citizens and their representatives making decisions about what rights and entitlements others have. He also mentions the problem known as the tyranny of the majority. This is where a democratic majority is able to violate the rights of a smaller minority. That's a very real issue in our modern democracies. We saw it through the pandemic, where a certain minority were essentially trod on. Their rights went out the window. He goes on, in both same-sex marriage and voice votes, there is a large majority with the power to decide the rights of a minority. With regards to the voice, I think this statement is poorly worded. Actually, the entire question is flawed, I would suggest. Should one group get to decide for another group? I'd argue that it's not one group deciding for another group. It's not non-Indigenous people deciding on the rights of Indigenous people. There's only a single group voting in this referendum, Australian citizens. Australians as a collective are deciding on this constitutional change. It seems the professor is trying to set up an us versus them mentality. Democracies typically guard against a majority mistreating a minority, in part by enshrining foundational rights and liberties in a constitution that is difficult to change democratically. This puts an imperfect but practical check on the exercise of that tyranny. Okay, perhaps not directly, he's indirectly making it sound like the only way that we can protect the minority, Aboriginal people in this case, from being mistreated by the evil majority is by enshrining something in the Constitution. Anyway, as I said, I don't like this question. It's making it sound like that there are two distinct categories of Australian citizens, Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, with one requiring constitutional protection, as if they're not already covered by the same constitution that all Australians are covered by. Moving on to the second concern, should one group get something others don't get? This leads to the second issue, whether there is something undemocratic about members of one group having different rights to members of other groups. This is not necessarily problematic, although it can be. Members who belong to one group, such as the citizens of Queensland, have rights that members of other groups, such as the citizens of New South Wales, do not have, such as being entitled to elect representatives to the Queensland Parliament. So because New South Wales people can't vote in Queensland elections, therefore it's ethically okay to enact a constitutional change based purely on one's ethnicity? Checkmate, no voters. Obviously, I think that argument is a bit of a stretch. Something similar would apply to the voice, with First Nations people having the right to elect members to the voice that members of other groups would not have. Okay, but it still raises the ethical question, why should First Nations people be entitled to this voice where other Australians will not? Why not have a voice for Scottish Australians, or Chinese Australians, or female Australians, or transgender Australians? Where does it stop? Although the professor does address this in the next paragraph. But surely not every group should have its own constitutionally enshrined voice. On what basis should we grant the First Peoples of Australia such a right? There are at least two obvious bases. First, as a rectification of past injustices. For example, if someone steals a painting from you, then you are entitled to have your property back or to receive restitution. This can apply cross-generationally. If the Nazis stole your great-grandfather's painting, then you are entitled to have it returned to you or receive compensation if the painting emerges many years later, even if your great-grandfather is long deceased. Yes, he mentioned Nazis. Have you heard of Godwin's law? It basically states that as an argument progresses, it becomes more and more likely that someone will talk about the Nazis. According to tradition, anybody who invokes the Nazis loses the debate. Sorry, Professor, you've just lost the argument. Okay, perhaps I'm being a bit harsh, but saying that because somebody is entitled to have their painting returned that was stolen by the Nazis, therefore we should change our constitution to include an Indigenous voice? I don't quite follow. I suppose he's saying that Aboriginal people had their land stolen from them, therefore, just like the Nazi painting, we should return their land to them. But I think he forgets that in doing so, he'll be dispossessing every other Australian of their land. We, as in people who are alive today, didn't steal their land. We are not guilty of any crime. But if we were to say that we must give land back that we currently own in some form of intergenerational compensation, that would certainly be stealing land from us. Two wrongs do not make a right. He goes on, First Nations people of Australia have suffered specific and significant injustices that other groups have not, such as the loss of sovereignty over their traditional lands, and they are therefore entitled to redress, which could, in part, take the form of a voice. If you go back far enough in history, we have all suffered some sort of significant injustice. For example, many of us are descendants of convicts who were forcefully transported to Australia. We didn't ask to be taken here, we were made to. We match the rights to the kinds of disadvantage being compensated for. For example, Australians with a disability are entitled to certain rights, such as disability support, that members of other groups are not. On a range of measures, from health to education and wealth, Australia's First Nations people face significant disadvantages, and it's therefore reasonable that members of that group receive specific rights to counteract the specific forms of disadvantage they experience. I just don't think that's comparable. Yes, many people are born with a disability, but people can also acquire a disability throughout life, unlike one's ethnicity. In Australia, we offer people with a disability some extra benefits because they are physically or mentally unable to support themselves without that support, usually through no fault of their own. It's disingenuous and, quite frankly, paternalistic to say that Aboriginal people are in the same category. To say that they can't look after themselves without some sort of government intervention is just plain, what's the word I'm looking for? Disdainful. It's disrespectful at the very least. There are many successful Aboriginal Australians. To say otherwise is a lie. There are so many Aboriginal programs and support in Australia. Aboriginal Australians have every opportunity and more. The professor concludes, neither of these questions are the important ones. In democracies, majorities are asked to vote on what rights a minority has, and members of different groups can have different rights. Rather than focus on whether a voice would divide us by race, We should focus, among other things, on the substantive issues of whether the proposed changes will be effective in helping to rectify past injustices or to counteract specific disadvantages, and whether any such changes should be embedded in our Constitution. Inclusion in the Constitution would serve as an enduring expression of their foundational role in our political community and would partially insulate them from democratic meddling. You know what I think? I think this entire article, and other articles like it, serve one purpose: to allow comfortably middle and upper class yes voters to bask in their own sense of self-importance and profoundly superior moral righteousness. They're blinded to their own racism. It's almost like they're trying to convince themselves that it's okay to give one ethnic group a constitutional advantage. And they don't even realise that these articles with their questionable arguments do nothing to sway people's vote. Do you think Terry, who works down at the local IGA, is going to be swayed by the ethically superior ramblings of a professor from Macquarie University? No, of course not. Actually, the whole debate is kind of pointless. Any answer will very quickly conclude that the sovereignty and power of a nation-state is pretty much arbitrary. Nations don't need to be right and good. Just look at any country across the globe. It's a perversely contemporary Western ideal that our countries should be ethical and justified.